Sterling Maddox had been saving himself for someone special for 35 years. He never expected her to show up unconscious, soaking wet, and bleeding on his kitchen table at 3 in the morning. The lantern flickered against her pale face as he tried to understand how a woman in a torn wedding dress had ended up in his locked barn, with no horse, no wagon, and no explanation. The nearest town was 40 miles away, and the storm outside hadn't let up for 6 hours. He pressed a damp cloth against the gash on her forehead, watching her chest rise and fall. Her breathing was steady, but something about this whole situation felt wrong. Sterling had lived on this remote ranch for 15 years and nothing, absolutely nothing, ever happened here without his knowledge. Every fence was secure, every gate was locked, and he knew every sound the wind made through these hills. Yet somehow, this woman had appeared in his barn like she'd fallen from the sky. The storm had started just after sunset, fierce and sudden in a way that didn't match the clear skies he'd seen all afternoon. Sterling had been checking his cattle when the first drops hit, and by the time he'd made it back to the house, the rain was coming down in sheets. He'd settled in for the night with his usual routine: black coffee, yesterday's newspaper, and the familiar silence that had been his only companion for years. Then he'd heard the noise, not the usual creaking of wood or rattling of windows, but something else, something that made him grab his rifle and step out into the downpour. The barn door, which he'd personally secured an hour earlier, was hanging wide open. Inside, scattered hay and overturned feed buckets suggested some kind of struggle. And there, collapsed beside an empty horse stall, was this woman. Sterling studied her face in the lamplight. She was beautiful, but not in the way of the town women who occasionally tried to catch his attention. There was something genuine about her features, even unconscious. Her dark hair was matted with rain and blood, and her wedding dress, while torn and muddy, was made of fine white silk. This wasn't some drifter or desperate soul. This was someone who should have been at her own wedding, someone with a life, a purpose, people who would be looking for her. But how had she gotten here? The closest neighbor was the Morrison Ranch, 12 miles east, and old Bill Morrison would have mentioned if he was expecting visitors. The main road that connected the larger towns ran north of Sterling's property, but it was a treacherous path on a good day, and impossible in weather like this. No sane person would attempt it. Sterling dipped the cloth in clean water and dabbed at the cut again. As he did, the woman's eyes fluttered open. They were green, sharp with intelligence even through the confusion of waking up in a stranger's house. She tried to sit up, winced at the pain, and looked around with the careful alertness of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice hoarse but steady. "My ranch," Sterling replied, setting down the cloth. "About 40 miles from anywhere that matters. The question is, how did you get here?" She touched the bandage on her forehead, her brow furrowing as she tried to remember. I was supposed to be getting married today, to Thomas Brennan, but I couldn't go through with it. I escaped from the church during the ceremony and rode north into the mountains to get away." She trailed off, her confusion deepening. "But the storm was so fierce I couldn't see anything. I must have gotten completely turned around and ridden for hours." Sterling nodded grimly. "Running from your own wedding and getting lost in mountain trails during a storm. That explained the wedding dress and her desperate condition. Those mountain trails are death traps in weather like this. Easy to lose your bearings and end up riding in circles for hours." But before he could ask how someone ends up 90 miles off course in a single night, the woman sat up straighter and said something that made his blood run cold. "What happened to my horse?" Sterling's jaw tightened at her question. He'd been dreading this moment, but lying wouldn't help either of them. "There was no horse when I found you," he said quietly. "Just you, unconscious in my barn." Clarice, she'd introduced herself as Clarice Knox, stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. She'd changed from her torn wedding dress into one of his clean work shirts and a pair of his smaller pants, rolled up at the cuffs. The practical clothes made her look less like a runaway bride and more like someone ready to face whatever came next. "That's impossible. Duchess was right beside me when I fell. She's been my traveling companion for 3 years. She wouldn't just abandon me." Her voice carried the conviction of someone stating an undeniable truth, which somehow made the situation even more unsettling. Sterling walked to the window and peered out through the rain-streaked glass. The storm was still raging, but he could make out the shapes of his own horses huddled under the shelter he'd built for them. 23 animals, all accounted for. Miss Knox, I've walked every inch of this property twice tonight. There's no horse here except my own. Then someone took her. Clarice swung her legs over the side of the table, testing her balance. Despite the head injury, she seemed determined to move. Duchess is worth more than most people see in a year. Someone could have seen an opportunity and, in this storm, Sterling turned back to face her. In the middle of nowhere? Miss Knox, the nearest person to this ranch, is 12 miles away, and he's 70 years old with arthritis in both knees. Nobody's out there stealing horses tonight. But even as he said it, Sterling felt his own doubts creeping in. The barn door had been forced open from the inside, not the outside. The scattered hay and overturned buckets suggested a struggle, or at least some kind of frantic activity. And now he was starting to remember something else. Fresh hoofprints in the mud near the barn entrance. Prints that were already being washed away by the rain when he'd found her. Clarice was studying his face with those sharp green eyes. "You're not telling me something," she said. It wasn't a question. Sterling hesitated. In his 15 years of isolation, he'd grown comfortable with silence, with keeping his thoughts to himself. But this woman, this stranger who'd appeared in his barn like a puzzle with missing pieces, seemed to see right through him. "There were hoofprints," he admitted, "near where I found you. But they were wrong somehow. Wrong how? Too deep. Like whatever made them was carrying a heavy load or moving very fast. And they led away from the barn toward the north pasture." Sterling ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that betrayed his growing unease. "But here's the thing, Miss Knox. That pasture is surrounded by a 6-foot fence. The only way out is through the gate, and I checked it twice tonight. It's locked tight." Clarice was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller, more vulnerable than before. "Mr. Maddox, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "All right. What day is it?" The question caught him off guard. "Friday, April 18th. Relief flooded her features. "Good. That's right. I left Emma's letter behind on Thursday morning, rode for most of the day, and made camp about 10 miles from town. The storm hit around sunset and—" She paused, her relief fading. "But that still doesn't explain how I ended up 90 miles north of where I was supposed to be." Sterling was about to respond when a sound from outside made them both freeze. It was faint, almost lost in the howling wind, but unmistakable. The whinny of a horse. Not the familiar sounds of his own animals, but something different. Something closer. Clarice's eyes lit up with hope. "Duchess," she whispered. But Sterling was already reaching for his rifle, because the sound hadn't come from his corral or his sheltered pasture. It had come from somewhere much closer to the house, somewhere no horse should be able to reach in this weather. As they listened, the sound came again, a desperate, almost human cry that seemed to be calling for something. Or someone. "That doesn't sound like any horse I've ever heard," Sterling muttered, checking his weapon. And that's when they heard the footsteps on his porch. Sterling motioned for Clarice to stay quiet as the footsteps moved across his porch. They were deliberate, measured, not the frantic stumbling of someone lost in a storm. Someone was testing each board, moving carefully toward his front door. In 15 years of living alone, Sterling had never had an unexpected visitor, especially not at 3 in the morning during a downpour. The footsteps stopped directly in front of his door. Sterling positioned himself between Clarice and the entrance, rifle ready but not yet raised. Through the thick wooden door, he could hear breathing, deep labored breaths of someone who'd been traveling hard through the storm. Then came 3 slow, deliberate knocks. "Mr. Maddox?" The voice was male, older, with an accent Sterling couldn't quite place. "I know you're awake in there. I saw your light." Sterling exchanged a glance with Clarice. Her face had gone pale, and she was shaking her head frantically, mouthing the word "no" over and over. Whatever was happening here, she recognized that voice, and she was terrified of it. "Who's asking?" Sterling called out, keeping his voice steady. "Name's Dutch Carmichael. I'm looking for someone who might have come this way." A young woman who fled her own wedding. Dark hair, green eyes, wearing a white wedding dress. "She's my responsibility, and I need to bring her home." Clarice grabbed Sterling's arm, her grip tight enough to leave marks. Her eyes were wide with fear, and she was shaking her head even more vigorously. Whatever relationship she had with this Dutch Carmichael, it wasn't one she wanted renewed. Sterling made a decision that surprised even him. "Haven't seen anyone like that," he lied smoothly. "Been just me and my animals all week." The silence that followed stretched long enough to make Sterling wonder if the man had left. Then Dutch spoke again, and his tone had changed completely. "That's interesting, Mr. Maddox, because I've been tracking her for 2 days now, and her trail leads directly to your barn." Sterling felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. "Don't know what to tell you, friend. Maybe the storm washed away whatever you think you saw. Maybe." Dutch's voice carried a hint of amusement now, as if he were enjoying a private joke. "Tell me something, Mr. Maddox. You ever notice how some coincidences are just too convenient to be real?" Before Sterling could respond, Dutch continued. "See, I've been asking around about you. Turns out you're something of a legend in these parts. The hermit rancher who never takes a wife, never goes to town social gatherings, never shows interest in female companionship. Some folks say you're waiting for the right woman to come along." Sterling's blood ran cold. This wasn't just someone looking for a lost traveler. This was someone who'd done research, who'd planned this encounter. "What's your point?" Sterling asked. "My point is that it would be mighty convenient if the right woman just happened to show up at your isolated ranch in the middle of a storm. Injured, vulnerable, needing a strong man to take care of her." Dutch's chuckle was low and unpleasant, almost like someone planned it that way. Clarice's grip on Sterling's arm tightened even more, and he could feel her trembling. Whatever game Dutch Carmichael was playing, she knew the rules, and they weren't in her favor. "Course there's another explanation," Dutch continued. "Maybe the woman I'm tracking really did make it this far. Maybe she's inside your house right now, listening to every word I'm saying. In which case, I should probably mention that her father is offering a substantial reward for her safe return." Sterling's mind raced. Father? Clarice had mentioned a cousin, but nothing about family that might be searching for her. And if someone were harboring her, Dutch's voice took on a dangerous edge, well, that would make them accessories to theft. "Because you see, Mr. Maddox, Miss Knox didn't just disappear. She took something very valuable with her." Sterling looked at Clarice, whose face had gone from pale to ashen. For the first time since she'd awakened, she looked genuinely guilty. "What did you take?" Sterling whispered. But before Clarice could answer, Dutch delivered his final bombshell. "She stole $50,000 from her father's safe, and I'm here to bring both her and the money home." Sterling stared at Clarice, searching her face for any sign that Dutch was lying. But the guilt written across her features told him everything he needed to know. She had taken something, and now he was caught in the middle of it. "Is it true?" he asked quietly. Clarice's voice was barely a whisper. "You don't understand. It wasn't stealing. That money was meant for me anyway. My father promised it as my inheritance, but he changed his mind when I refused to marry the man he chose." Her eyes filled with tears, but there was steel beneath them. "He was going to force me into a marriage with a man who beats his horses and treats women like property. The money was my only way out." Sterling felt something inside him shift. He'd spent 35 years avoiding complications, keeping his life simple and isolated. But looking at this woman, this brave, desperate woman who'd risked everything for her freedom, he realized that some things were worth the complication. "Mr. Maddox," Dutch called from outside, his patience clearly wearing thin. "I can wait here all night if necessary, but come morning, I'll be back with the sheriff and a warrant. Things will go much easier for everyone if we settle this now." Sterling made another decision that surprised him. "Miss Knox," he said loud enough for Dutch to hear, "I think you should tell this gentleman exactly what you told me." Clarice looked at him with confusion and betrayal, clearly thinking he was about to hand her over. But Sterling gave her a look that said, "Trust me," and something in his eyes must have convinced her. "Mr. Carmichael," she called out, her voice stronger now, "I assume my father sent you to drag me back to marry Thomas Brennan. Well, you can tell him that I'd rather die in this storm than go back to that life." Dutch's laughter was cold. "Your father didn't send me, Miss Knox. Thomas Brennan did. Seems he's quite invested in this marriage arrangement, and he's willing to pay handsomely to ensure it happens." Sterling felt the pieces clicking into place. This wasn't about a father wanting his daughter back, or even about stolen money. This was about a man buying himself a wife, and Dutch Carmichael was the kind of person who made such transactions possible. "How much is he paying you?" Sterling called out. "More than a hermit rancher could afford, I imagine." Dutch's voice carried a sneer. "But I'm a reasonable man. Perhaps we could work out an arrangement. You keep the woman for the night, enjoy her company, and in the morning you hand her over. No questions asked." The crude implication in Dutch's words made Sterling's blood boil. Without thinking, He moved toward the door, but Clarice grabbed his arm again. "Don't," she whispered urgently. "That's exactly what he wants. Dutch Carmichael isn't just a bounty hunter. He's a killer. He's probably got men positioned around your house already." As if summoned by her words, Sterling heard the faint sound of horses moving through the storm. Not one horse, but several, trying to stay quiet but failing against the wind and rain. Dutch hadn't come alone. "Smart girl," Dutch called out, apparently hearing their whispered conversation, "but not smart enough. See, Mr. Maddox, I've got 4 men with me, and we've been tracking runaways and thieves for 10 years. We know how to handle situations like this." Sterling moved to another window and peered out carefully. Through the rain, he could make out the shapes of riders positioned around his house. They had him surrounded, and they'd done it quietly enough that he hadn't noticed until now. "But here's the thing about siege situations," Dutch continued conversationally. "They only work if the people inside don't have anywhere to go. Unfortunately for you folks, I happen to know that your ranch has a back exit through the root cellar. Leads right out to your equipment shed, doesn't it?" Sterling's heart sank. That cellar exit was his emergency escape route, something he'd installed years ago but never expected to use. How could Dutch possibly know about it? "Oh, you're wondering how I know about your little secret." Dutch's voice was full of satisfaction. "Well, Mr. Maddox, turns out your hired hand Billy Morrison has quite a drinking problem. And when Billy drinks, he talks about all sorts of interesting things, like hidden exits and the habits of hermit ranchers." Sterling closed his eyes in frustration. Billy Morrison was old Bill's nephew, who'd worked on Sterling's ranch for 2 summers running repairs. Sterling had shown him the cellar exit during a particularly bad thunderstorm, thinking it was just common sense to know all the ways out of a building. "So here's how this is going to work," Dutch continued. "You've got exactly 5 minutes to send Miss Knox out that front door. If you don't, my men are going to start a fire in your equipment shed, and when you come running out the back way, we'll be waiting." Clarice looked at Sterling with desperate eyes. "I won't let him burn down your ranch because of me. I'll go." But Sterling was already moving toward a cabinet in the corner of his kitchen. When he opened it, Clarice saw something that made her breath catch. Enough weapons and ammunition to outfit a small army. "Miss Knox," Sterling said grimly, checking his rifle and grabbing extra shells, "I've been saving myself for someone special for 35 years. I'll be damned if I'm going to let some hired gun take her away on the first night we meet." But just as he finished loading his weapon, they heard something that made them both freeze. The unmistakable sound of crackling flames coming from the direction of his equipment shed. If this story is touching you in any way, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with someone who loves a good Western tale, and subscribe to the Western Redemption channel. Every single day at exactly 10 a.m., a brand new story drops, packed with emotion, justice, and redemption. So turn on the notification bell and don't miss the next chapter, because out here in the West, no one waits around. The orange glow from the equipment shed painted the storm clouds with an ominous light. Sterling watched 15 years of carefully maintained tools and machinery going up in flames, but his anger wasn't directed at the fire. It was focused on the men who thought they could force his hand through destruction. "They made a mistake," Sterling said quietly, checking his ammunition count. "That shed is downwind from my cattle shelter. If this fire spreads, 23 horses are going to panic and scatter across the valley." Clarice didn't understand why this mattered, until she saw Sterling's grim smile. When horses run in a storm like this, they run blind. They'll go right through anything in their path, including men waiting in ambush positions. But your animals know this land better than any human ever will. They'll find shelter and wait out the storm. Dutch's men won't be so lucky. Sterling moved to the back window and carefully opened it a crack. The smoke was already thick enough to mask their movements, and the wind was driving the flames exactly where he'd predicted. Outside, they could hear Dutch shouting orders to his men, his voice tight with frustration. The fire was spreading faster than he'd anticipated, and the smoke was making it impossible for his shooters to maintain clear sightlines. "Mr. Maddox," Dutch called out, his earlier confidence replaced by urgency. "Send the woman out now, or we all burn together." But Sterling was already moving. He grabbed a heavy coat from a peg by the door and handed it to Clarice. "We're not going out the back exit," he said. "We're going out the front door." Clarice stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. "That's exactly what they're expecting." "No, they're expecting us to try the back way and run into their trap. They're not expecting us to walk straight into what they think is their strength." Sterling shouldered his rifle and picked up a second weapon. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is exactly what your enemy wants you to do. He moved to the front door and called out to Dutch. "All right, Carmichael, you win. I'm sending her out." The relief in Dutch's voice was audible. "Smart man, Maddox. Have her walk slow and keep her hands where we can see them." Sterling turned to Clarice, his voice dropping to a whisper. "When I open this door, you're going to count to 3, then drop flat on the porch and stay down. No matter what happens, don't move until I tell you." "Sterling, this is insane." "Trust me." He looked into her eyes, and for a moment the chaos outside faded away. "I told you I've been waiting 35 years for someone special. I meant it." Sterling threw open the front door and gently pushed Clarice forward. She stepped onto the porch, hands raised, moving slowly as instructed. Through the smoke and rain, Sterling could see Dutch emerging from his position behind the water trough, a satisfied smile on his weathered face. "That's right, Miss Knox," Dutch called out. "Just keep walking toward me. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. Clarice dropped flat, just as Sterling opened fire. But instead of aiming at Dutch or his men, Sterling shot directly into the support beam of his own barn roof. The old timber, weakened by years of weather and now soaked with rain, gave way with a thunderous crack. A section of the roof collapsed, sending a cascade of water and debris directly onto Dutch's position. In the confusion that followed, Sterling's cattle, already spooked by the fire and now terrified by the noise, broke free from their shelter and stampeded directly through the yard where Dutch's men had been positioned. The sound was deafening. 23 panicked horses charging through the storm, their hooves pounding against the muddy ground like thunder. Dutch's men scattered, abandoning their positions and diving for whatever cover they could find. Sterling grabbed Clarice and pulled her back into the house, slamming the door behind them. Through the window, they could see Dutch trying to regain control of the situation, shouting orders that no one could hear over the chaos. "You destroyed your own barn," Clarice said, staring at him in amazement. "I can rebuild a barn," Sterling replied, reloading his rifle. "I can't replace you." But their moment of triumph was short-lived. Dutch's voice cut through the noise outside, closer to the house than before. "Very clever, Maddox, but all you've done is buy yourself a few minutes." Sterling peered out the window and felt his heart sink. The stampede had scattered Dutch's men, but it hadn't eliminated them. They were regrouping at the edge of his property, and Dutch himself was approaching the house again, this time with a burning torch in his hand. "Last chance, Maddox," Dutch shouted. "Send her out, or I burn down your house with both of you inside." Sterling looked at Clarice, then at the flames reflecting in the windows, then back at Dutch's approaching figure. They'd bought themselves time, but not freedom, and now Dutch was done playing games. That's when Clarice said something that changed everything. "Sterling, what if I told you there was no money?" Sterling turned to stare at Clarice, Dutch's approaching footsteps momentarily forgotten. "What do you mean there's no money?" "I never took $50,000 from my father's safe," Clarice said rapidly, her words tumbling over each other in her urgency to explain. "I took $50, my own money that he'd been keeping from me. But when I left, I also took something else, something that Thomas Brennan wants back much more than any amount of cash." "What?" "Letters. A whole stack of them, detailing his business dealings with corrupt officials in 3 different territories. Thomas Brennan isn't just a cruel man looking for a wife. He's been buying government contracts through bribery and extortion. Those letters could destroy him and send him to prison for 20 years. Sterling's mind raced as the pieces fell into place. That's why he hired Dutch. Not to bring back a runaway bride, but to recover evidence that could destroy him. And that's why Dutch is so determined. Thomas probably promised him more money than he's ever seen. Clarice grabbed Sterling's arm again, but this time her grip was firm with determination rather than fear. "Sterling, those letters are hidden in my saddlebags. If Dutch gets them back, Thomas Brennan goes free and probably forces me into marriage anyway to keep me quiet. But your horse is probably wandering around your north pasture, looking for shelter from the storm. You said yourself the hoofprints led that way." Clarice moved to the window and peered out through the smoke. "Duchess is smart. She would have found the highest, driest ground she could and waited." Outside, Dutch had reached the porch again, and they could hear him moving around the house, testing windows and looking for weak points. The torch in his hand cast dancing shadows across the walls, and Sterling could smell the smoke beginning to seep through the wooden frame. "Here's what we're going to do," Sterling said, making another split-second decision. "I'm going to give Dutch exactly what he's asking for." "Sterling, no." I'm going to walk out that door and surrender." Sterling's voice was calm, almost conversational. "And while he's focused on me, you're going to slip out the kitchen window and head for the north pasture. Find your horse, get those letters, and ride for town." Clarice shook her head vigorously. "I won't leave you to face him alone. You have to. Those letters are the only thing that can stop Thomas Brennan and men like Dutch from ruining other people's lives." Sterling checked his rifle one final time. "Besides, I've got a few surprises left." Before Clarice could protest further, Sterling called out to Dutch. "All right, Carmichael, I'm coming out, but I want your word that you won't hurt the woman." Dutch's laughter was harsh. "You're hardly in a position to negotiate, Maddox." "Maybe not, but I'm the only thing standing between you and what you want. You kill me, and you'll have to burn down this house to get to her. That'll bring the sheriff running, and I doubt Thomas Brennan wants that kind of attention." There was a pause, and Sterling could almost hear Dutch calculating the risks. "Fine. Come out with your hands up and we'll talk." Sterling turned to Clarice one last time. "The kitchen window faces away from where his men are positioned. Give me 30 seconds to get Dutch's attention, then move fast and quiet. What if I can't find Duchess? What if the letters are damaged by the rain? Then we'll figure out another way. But right now, this is our best chance." Sterling surprised himself by reaching out and touching her face gently. "Clarice, I want you to know, even if I'd been waiting 100 years instead of 35, you would have been worth it." Before she could respond, Sterling opened the front door and stepped out into the storm. Dutch was waiting for him at the bottom of the porch steps, torch held high, his other hand resting on his gun. Behind him, Sterling could see his men emerging from their cover positions, weapons drawn but not yet aimed. "Smart choice, Maddox," Dutch said. "Now where's the woman?" "Inside. Scared out of her mind thanks to you." Sterling kept his hands visible but ready. "But before you take her, I think you should know something about those letters she's carrying." Dutch's expression sharpened. "What letters?" Sterling smiled grimly. "The ones that prove Thomas Brennan has been bribing territorial officials for the past 5 years. The ones that detail exactly how much money changed hands, and when, and for what contracts." He paused for effect. "The ones that mention your name as the man who delivered the bribes." For the first time since this confrontation began, Dutch looked genuinely worried. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" "Think about it, Dutch. Why would Thomas Brennan hire you specifically for this job? Because you're the best tracker? Or because you're the only witness to his crimes that he can control?" Sterling took a step forward. "What happens to you when he doesn't need you anymore?" Sterling could see the doubt creeping into Dutch's eyes, and he pressed his advantage. "Those letters don't just destroy Thomas Brennan. They destroy everyone who helped him, including you." That's when they heard it. The sound of a horse galloping away through the storm, heading toward town at full speed. Dutch spun around, realizing too late that he'd been outmaneuvered. "Find her!" he screamed at his men. "Don't let her reach town!" But Sterling was already moving, and he had one more surprise that Dutch hadn't counted on. He knew exactly which of his own horses was the fastest, and he'd positioned it perfectly for this moment. The question was whether Clarice had found those letters, and whether either of them would live long enough to use them. Dutch's face twisted with rage as the sound of Clarice's horse faded into the storm. "You played me," he snarled, raising his torch toward Sterling. "But it doesn't matter. My men will catch her before she reaches town, and you're going to burn for this." Sterling stood his ground, hands still visible but ready. "Your men are chasing shadows in a storm, Dutch, and even if they catch her, those letters have already been copied." The lie came easily, but it had the desired effect. Dutch hesitated, uncertainty flickering across his features. "You're bluffing again." "Am I? Think about it. A woman smart enough to steal evidence that could destroy Thomas Brennan, smart enough to escape an arranged marriage, smart enough to disappear for 2 days while you tracked her. You really think she'd carry the only copies of those letters?" Sterling took another step forward. "She made copies before she left her father's house. Sent them to 3 different newspapers in 3 different territories." Dutch's torch wavered, and Sterling could see the fear creeping into the bounty hunter's eyes. For 10 years, Dutch Carmichael had been Thomas Brennan's cleanup man, handling problems that couldn't be solved through legal channels. He'd delivered bribes, intimidated witnesses, and made inconvenient people disappear. If those letters became public, Dutch wouldn't just lose his livelihood, he'd spend the rest of his life in prison. "Even if that's true," Dutch said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Brennan will find a way to discredit them. He always does. Not this time, because there's one witness Brennan can't discredit or eliminate. Sterling's smile was cold. You. Dutch stared at him, not understanding. You delivered those bribes personally, Dutch. You were in the room when the deals were made. Clarice's letters might start the investigation, but your testimony is what will finish Thomas Brennan. Sterling paused. Of course, that only works if you're alive to testify. The implication hung in the air between them. Dutch had been so focused on retrieving the letters that he hadn't considered what would happen afterward. Thomas Brennan was a man who eliminated loose ends, and Dutch Carmichael was the loosest end of all. You're trying to turn me against my employer, Dutch said, but there was doubt in his voice now. I'm trying to save your life, and mine, and Clarice's. Sterling gestured toward the flames still consuming his equipment shed. Look around you, Dutch. Look at what you've already done on Brennan's orders. You think a man who orders you to burn down an innocent person's ranch is going to let you walk away with first-hand knowledge of his crimes? Dutch was quiet for a long moment, processing this. Behind him, his men were mounting their horses to pursue Clarice. But Sterling could see the leader's resolve wavering. That's when they heard the sound Sterling had been hoping for. Multiple horses approaching fast from the direction of town. But instead of Dutch's men returning, these were fresh horses carrying riders who knew the territory well. Dutch spun around, squinting through the smoke and rain. Who the hell? Sheriff Morrison and his deputies, Sterling said calmly. I sent word to town yesterday about suspicious riders in the area. Bill Morrison might be old, but he's not stupid. When his nephew Billy mentioned Dutch Carmichael was asking questions about my ranch, Bill knew trouble was coming. The approaching riders emerged from the storm, and Sterling could see Sheriff Morrison's badge glinting in the firelight. Behind him rode 3 deputies, all armed and ready for trouble. Dutch raised his torch higher, his free hand moving to his gun. This doesn't change anything. Maddox, even if they arrest me, Brennan will have me out in a week. Maybe, but that's assuming you live long enough to stand trial. Sterling nodded toward the horizon, where the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the sky. Because in about 2 hours, when those letters reach the territorial governor's office, Thomas Brennan is going to realize that you're his biggest liability. Dutch's face went pale as the full implication hit him. He was trapped between the law closing in from one side and his employer's inevitable betrayal from the other. Sheriff Morrison reined in his horse just outside the circle of firelight. Dutch Carmichael, he called out, his voice carrying the authority of 20 years in law enforcement. You're under arrest for arson, intimidation, and trespassing. Drop your weapons and surrender. Dutch looked around desperately. His men were still pursuing Clarice, leaving him outnumbered and outgunned. The torch in his hand was burning low, and Sterling could see the moment when desperation turned to panic. I want to make a deal, Dutch called out to the sheriff. I have information about Thomas Brennan's illegal activities, bribery, corruption, witness intimidation, everything. Sheriff Morrison exchanged a glance with Sterling. We're listening. But just as Dutch opened his mouth to speak, a gunshot echoed across the valley. It came from the direction Clarice had ridden, and it was followed by a woman's scream that cut through the storm like a knife. Sterling's blood turned to ice. Dutch's men had caught up with her. Looks like your insurance policy just ran out, Maddox, Dutch said, his confidence returning. My boys have orders to bring the woman back alive, but accidents happen in weather like this. Sterling looked at the sheriff, then at Dutch, then toward the sound of that terrible scream. He had seconds to make a decision that would determine whether Clarice lived or died, and whether the evidence that could stop Thomas Brennan would ever see the light of day. Sterling was already reaching for his horse when Sheriff Morrison's hand stopped him. Wait, the sheriff said quietly. Listen. Through the dying storm, they could hear voices in the distance, not screams of distress, but shouts of frustration and anger. Dutch's men were yelling at each other, their voices carrying a tone of confusion rather than triumph. That wasn't a scream of pain, Morrison said grimly. That was someone playing decoy. As if summoned by his words, the sound of a single horse approached from the east, the opposite direction from where Dutch's men were searching. Clarice emerged from the gray dawn light, riding a fresh horse and wearing a determined expression that made Sterling's heart leap with relief. Dutch stared at her in disbelief. Impossible. My men went after you. You heard exactly what I wanted you to hear, Clarice said, dismounting and walking calmly toward the group. I found my horse, retrieved the letters, and rode straight to town. When I saw your men following, I led them on a chase through Echo Canyon while Sheriff Morrison's deputy rode my evidence directly to the territorial office. She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded telegram. This arrived at the sheriff's office 20 minutes ago. Thomas Brennan has been arrested in his home, along with 3 territorial officials. The governor has ordered a full investigation into all contracts awarded in the past 5 years. Dutch's torch slipped from his numb fingers and hissed out in the muddy ground. His empire of corruption had collapsed in a single night, and he knew it. "It's over, Dutch," Sheriff Morrison said, stepping forward with handcuffs. "You can cooperate with the investigation and maybe see daylight again before you're 70, or you can stay loyal to Thomas Brennan and spend the rest of your life in prison." Dutch looked around at the faces surrounding him. Sterling's quiet determination, Clarice's steel-eyed resolve, the sheriff's patient authority. For 10 years he'd been the one holding the power, but now he was just another criminal facing justice. "I'll testify," Dutch said quietly. "I'll tell you everything Thomas Brennan ever did, every bribe he paid, every person he hurt. But I want it in writing that I cooperated." "You'll get your deal," Morrison replied, snapping the handcuffs into place. "After you serve your time for what you did here tonight." As the sheriff led Dutch away, his remaining men emerged from the canyon, soaked and exhausted from their fruitless chase. They surrendered without resistance, their loyalty to Dutch extending only as far as their paychecks. Sterling found himself alone with Clarice as the dawn light grew stronger around them. His equipment shed was still smoldering, his barn roof was partially collapsed, and his carefully ordered life lay in ruins around him. "I'm sorry about your ranch," Clarice said softly. If you hadn't come here, I'd still be a lonely man waiting for something that might never happen." Sterling looked at the damage, then back at her. "Buildings can be rebuilt. Some things can't be replaced." Clarice stepped closer to him. "Sterling, I need you to know something. When I was riding to town tonight, all I could think about was getting back here. Not just to make sure you were safe, but because—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Because for the first time in my life, I found someone worth fighting for." Sterling felt something inside him settle into place, a sense of completeness he'd never experienced in 35 years of solitude. "Clarice Knox, I saved myself for someone special, but I never imagined she'd be brave enough to save herself." 6 months later, Sterling Maddox stood in the doorway of his rebuilt barn, watching his wife tend to the vegetable garden she'd planted behind their house. The equipment shed had been replaced with something larger and more efficient, and the damaged roof had been repaired with timber strong enough to last another 50 years. Clarice had insisted on keeping her own horse, the faithful Duchess who'd carried her through that terrible storm. But she'd also taken to riding Sterling's horses, learning the boundaries of their property and the rhythms of ranch life, with the same determination she'd shown when facing down Dutch Carmichael. Thomas Brennan had received a 20-year sentence for corruption and bribery. Dutch Carmichael had testified against him in exchange for a reduced sentence, and was currently serving 8 years in the territorial prison. The 3 corrupt officials had been stripped of their positions and faced their own trials. But the most significant change wasn't in the fates of their enemies. It was in Sterling himself. The man who'd spent decades avoiding complications had learned that the right complications could transform a life from empty to overflowing. "Sterling," Clarice called from the garden. "Come see what came up." He walked over to find her kneeling beside a row of young tomato plants, their green leaves bright with morning dew. "They're beautiful," he said. "They're ours," she replied, standing and brushing dirt from her hands. "Everything here is ours now, the good and the difficult, the easy days and the storms." Sterling pulled her close, marveling again at how perfectly she fit against his side. "You know, I used to think the best thing about this ranch was the silence. And now?" Sterling smiled, listening to the sounds around them. Chickens clucking in their pen, horses nickering in the pasture, Clarice's laughter mixing with the morning breeze. "Now I know the best thing about this ranch is that it's where you got lost and I got found." Clarice stood on her toes and kissed him. And Sterling Maddox realized that some kinds of waiting were worth a lifetime, especially when they ended with forever. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.